So welcome everybody to today's event, Rojava Today, Where is the Movement Now? My name is Blair Taylor and I'm the Program Director of the Institute for Social Ecology. We're very excited to host today's event along with the Kurdistan Solidarity Network. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the ISE, we're a popular education and movement reflection center founded by Murray Bookchin and Dan Chodorkov in 1974. And we focus on the intersection of social and ecological issues, broadly construed. The ISE has been active in Rojava solidarity work for many years. Some of you might be aware of the special relationship between social ecology and the Kurdish freedom movement. Movement leader Abdullah Öcalan read our founder Murray Bookchin's work in prison and reached out to him to share ideas. But unfortunately at that point in time, Murray was fairly old and ill and too ill to have a serious engagement at the time. But in the years since, the ties between our movements have only grown as the feminist, multi-ethnic, democratic project in Rojava is perhaps the clearest and most inspiring historical example of the politics of social ecology. And yet there have been some very big changes on the ground in the years since the siege of Kobane, which began almost exactly 6 years ago this week. So today we hope to give an update on where the movement stands now, what are some of the unique possibilities and challenges we're facing, and how we can best support this work. And before we continue, I also want to take a moment to honor our recently departed comrade, David Graeber, who passed away last week. David was the epitome of an activist scholar. Many of us knew him well and worked with him personally on a variety of projects. He was a tireless friend to the Kurdish movement. He spoke several times at the ISE's Renewing the Anarchist Tradition conference in the early 2000s. We worked together on the Life After Capitalism conference in 2004 in New York City, and later in the Occupy Wall Street movement. He was obviously a huge inspiration to us at the Institute and to the movements globally, and he will be greatly missed. So thank you all for joining us today and to our wonderful guests. Really looking forward to an excellent conversation and discussion. I'm going to hand things over now to our co-organizers, Katie and Chris, who will be introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Blair. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie. I organise with the Kurdistan Solidarity Network in the UK. We're a network of local groups and activists who organise in solidarity with the Kurdish freedom movement. As one of the most inspiring and arguably one of the most successful modern examples of an anti-fascist revolutionary social movement, with an incredible capacity for transformation and strategic thinking, we believe that we can learn a lot from this movement and better understand our place in internationalist struggle and as activists and organisers across the world by engaging with the movement's ideas, its practices, its ideologies, and these centre around the fight for radical democracy, gender liberation, cooperative economy and ecological sustainability. So we're hoping to touch on all these big ideas a little bit in the event this evening. And we have a couple of guests who we've invited along. So in a minute they'll introduce themselves and have about 10 to 15 minutes to speak a little bit about their experiences organising with the movement and in Rojava, and we will have time for questions, plenty of time we hope for questions at the end. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about two of our guests. Viyan is a UK-based internationalist who spent a year in Rojava participating in ecological projects with Make Rojava Green Again, working in a press and a research centre as well, and learning from the movement more broadly. Before spending a year in northeast Syria, Viyan was activist in feminist and environmental struggles in the UK for over a decade. So she's going to talk about how ecology creates a framework for the democratic.
God, it's too loud.
She's sorry. Apologies for that. Yeah, she's going to talk about how ecology creates a framework for the democratic confederalism and women's liberation, and reflect on lessons for activists and organisers around the world. Dilar is an activist in the Kurdish women's movement and a postdoctoral researcher at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. Dilar is the author of the chapter Only With You, This Broom Will Fly, Rojava, Magic and Sweeping Away the State Inside of Us, in the collection Deciding for Ourselves, The Promise of Direct Democracy from AK Press. Dilar will examine the fate of Rojava and the Kurdish freedom movement as it faces continued attack from Turkish and Syrian states, and also the power of revolutionary ideals of solidarity, liberation, and community at the heart of struggles against and beyond the state, and particularly through her experience as being an organizer with the Kurdish women's movement. I will hand over to Chris, who's going to introduce himself.
Hi, hello everybody. My name is Chris Shaw. I've been involved in Rojava solidarity work for about 4 years. Mostly in the medical field, and in that I've worked with one of our speakers, Argesh, who will be talking about security issues. And one of the things that led to this conference was concerns about what happens now with this amazing social experiment. And I know our speakers will address that, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they all have to say to tell us how the movements that has begun in Rojava and the implications, I think, for the rest of the world, how that goes forward with when under the circumstances where we see them, the autonomous regions surrounded by enemies of all kinds. And so I'm really curious to see how the speakers are going to address that and help us understand the role we might play in keeping this movement alive.
With that, I believe we'll hand things over to our first speaker, Dilar Dirik. Thank you so much for joining us. That's one moment. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Yes, hello everybody. It's so great to see so many of you participate in this exciting and important, timely conference. Thank you so much to the friends from the Institute for Social Ecology for organizing this, and of course Kurdistan Solidarity Network. So I think it's really important to keep the conversation going about Rojava, especially in light of what has recently been happening in the region, not least because of the systematic attacks on the gains and achievements of this project that is now soon actually a decade old. So we will soon be celebrating 10 years of the Rojava revolution and its contribution to the expansion of radical horizons around the world. But of course, it's important to always recognize that whatever we see today in Rojava has been a result of struggle. It was not a result of an easy process. It was the hard work and the labor of thousands of people who also gave their lives. And I think this very much also demonstrates the current situation that we find ourselves in which a NATO army, the second largest NATO army, is now mobilizing its forces to attack this region. So what I'm going to do is to give a brief overview of how we came to witness this revolution today. What qualifies it as a revolution? Who gets to claim that something is a revolution? Why do people call it a women's revolution? And also, what does revolution for the Kurdish movement mean today in the 21st century? In what ways is it not just a day in the calendar after which everything changes and the whole order of things gets put upside down, but actually it's about the transformation of social relations too. So how to make revolutions and revolutionary values, radical values, lasting, is also to make them social, to make them communal. So basically, it's important to put Rojava always into a historical context. It's not something, whilst very much defined by the spontaneous and energetic organization of of tens of thousands of people living there, it is part of a longer history of the struggle in Kurdistan. And it's also, of course, it has to be understood in the context of regional kind of developments at the time. The Rojava Revolution was declared on July 19th, 2012. But actually, if you ask many people, especially the women, about the beginning of the Rojava Revolution, they will say it actually started in 1979. When Abdullah Öcalan and leading cadres of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, right before the Turkish military coup in 1980, crossed into Syria in order to mobilize what they would soon launch as a guerrilla war against the Turkish state. So Öcalan, who's currently in prison and who has been in prison since 1999, has spent 20 years, between 79 and 98, so 19, almost 20 years inside Syria. And a lot of the people that are now at the forefront of the struggle in Rojava have actually personally met him, attended his lectures, his educations, and learned from him and the cadres of the Kurdistan Workers' Party about the history of Kurdistan, the need to decolonize Kurdistan. And at the time, this was very much also shaped by a Marxist-Leninist approach that was aspiring towards the creation of a Kurdish state and the decolonization of Kurdistan's economy, its lands, the defense of the Kurdish language, and so on. And this also meant at the same time that the first, if you will, social base of the Kurdish freedom movement that organizes around Öcalan's principles was actually first formed in Rojava. So many people, especially activists from an older generation, will say that with the arrival of Öcalan and his comrades in Syria, a new political culture arrived, where people were discussing new terms, new concepts, revolutionary culture, as they call it. And it was also the first time that women, Kurdish women in Syria, really entered the political sphere. So while a lot of the activists, not all, a lot of them, the activism in general, the political organizing that they were doing had to be held in secret in people's homes, privately, clandestinely. It was the first time when revolutionary women, they had come from northern Kurdistan, from inside Turkey, began organizing people in their homes. And Abdullah Öcalan's perspective also from the very beginning, from the very start of the movement, was that there can be no free society without the liberation of women. So for a lot of the people who are now at the forefront of defending Rojava, and also the first people who built up the women's defense units and the communes and assemblies, many of which we will get into those details in a bit, but for those people who have built up the system that we know today as either the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria or Rojava, Western Kurdistan, things did not start with 2012. And this is always important for social movements to remember, is that one cannot expect radical change to happen within years. It's not something that can happen after a day where people decide today we will declare revolution and then things change. No, there is a longer history to that. Actually, a 40-year-old history of political organization has led to what we see today. And so in this sense, of course, also 2012 has to be put into a regional context. At the time, there were protests in the region, in North Africa and in the Middle East. What is often called the Arab Spring meant that a lot of people went into the streets and demanded freedom and justice. But at the same time, we've seen that very early on, there were countries and organizations that were very much interested in a form of destabilizing the region, and the outcome of that we see that also still today. We'll talk about this later, but there was a momentum in which people took to the street, and as one activist described it, Rojava was the Kurdish answer to the system's imposition that there cannot be an alternative. And what does she mean by that is that at the time, especially the Obama administration imposition of an idea of moderate Islam that is especially pushing through countries such as Turkey and other countries. And also we know the role by now of countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Turkey for the rise of Islamism in the region. We cannot divorce these things from each other. So the peoples in the Middle East, although they have such long histories of justice seeking and struggle, are often put into a position in which they have to pick between two evils, either a dictator or imperialism, full colonialism or full-on civil war. And these things, in many ways, the Rojava revolution represents a break out of that through what they call a third way. So what is the third way? I mean, I'm trying to keep things very short so we also have later more time for elaboration. But basically the ideology and political project that is proposed by Abdullah Öcalan, who Blair also introduced earlier on, is based on three principles: a paradigm based on radical democracy, women's liberation, and ecology. And it is based on the assumption that a form of organizing life is possible without relying on the pillars of what he calls the capitalist modernity. And what he means by that is a system of oppression and domination. And here he draws very much work of Murray Bookchin that has a long history. So we should not understand the social problems, the political, economic problems that we have today as today's problems, but they actually go back in some ways 5,000 years with the institutionalization of hierarchy and domination in society, especially in the personage of women. So the colonization of women has also at the same time meant the colonization of society as a whole. So the Rojava revolution also at the same time represents a different way of thinking about who is society, who gets to be society. So Öcalan defends the idea that the state does not own society. Actually, the state needs society, but society does not need the state. There are ways in which people can organize themselves through grassroots democratic structures, through autonomous institutions, their own educational institutions, their own economic structures, and especially with the leadership of women and the youth as the primary subjects of the revolution. So how can we create a system that has a different mentality? So the Rojava revolution is basically, it's building on an ideology that says we need to also emotionally break with this capitalist modernity, which has led to nothing but cancerous growth of cities, of limitless growth, with the exploitation of nature, with the systematic violence against women, racism, and other forms of violence and oppression. So what does it mean, though, to do revolution in a society where the people have been fundamentally deprived of the means of production, of the means of decision making, and so on? So many of you who are attending now will know that the Kurdish people have been historically oppressed, not just in Syria, but in other parts of the world, often subjected to very brutal genocides. So in a system that is shaped by nation states, the easiest way out of violence seems to be to create another state. But in fact, we see the relationship between the nation state and capitalism and different forms of violence and war are so intertwined. And this movement, the project that Abdullah Öcalan proposes, is to overcome the deepest contradictions in the Middle East by way of creating a society that has a different form of organizing itself. But for that, it's especially important to have a clear political, ideological analysis of the current system that we live in. So in this sense, he and the movement in general are very critical of liberalism, for example, because liberalism is very much an outcome of this system that he describes as capitalist modernity, based on industrialism, based on nation state, based on positivist science as well. So how can people decolonize, if you will, from the state, and with that especially women, from male domination, is by building their own system. So what we've seen in Rojava since 2012 is, as I mentioned, is part of a longer history of the movement breaking with the ideology of the state as the solution towards saying actually the solution is the opposite, is to create democratic ecological societies that can organize themselves, that can reclaim the means of not just production, but also knowledge production, of meaning giving, of interpreting the world. So that, of course, means to have the chance to develop autonomous perspectives without reliance on corporate media, for example, without relying on the state's official version of history. So the movement is very much also keen on studying the democratic history of peoples in order to understand that this system that we live in at the moment is not fate. And I think this is how one should understand the emergence of Rojava, is in a moment of crisis in which, once again, very dark forces were trying to reshape the dynamics in the Middle East. It came out as an autonomous stance, if you will, to say actually the peoples in the Middle East and peoples everywhere deserve better. This is not fate. We're not condemned to a life of under sectarianism, Islamism, brutal, whether secular or religious, dictatorial nation states, and neoliberalism, and so on and so forth. This is not our fate. This is not what we. And the special thing about the Kurdish freedom movement in this sense, which is slightly different from other social movements, is and very much actually in line with a lot of work that's done by ecological movements and feminist movements and anarchist movements as well, is the insistence on creating forms of freedom in the here and now. So rather than to wait for something that may never come to happen and then we say, then we will work on gender equality and other things, is to say, how can we start inside our own communities, in fact, in our families, in fact, in ourselves, with liberating ourselves from the idea that the state owns our soul, basically owns the right to determine how we should live. And this is very difficult, and this is something that always needs to be stressed in order for people to not misunderstand what's happening in Rojava. This is happening under very difficult conditions of war and occupation. So it's not easy for people to be told that we can actually live outside of capitalism, or we can create alternatives to capitalism, when people are constantly under war and occupation. But yet there is this insistence, that yet there is this demand. And I think this very much resonates with the new social movements that we're seeing today. More and more young people, especially, we've seen so many people go out in the streets and demand not climate change, but system change. And there are efforts by the capitalist system, by states that are the most responsible for the ecological crisis, to greenwash capitalism. I mean, many people here in this conference will be familiar with this, but in many ways, the Kurdish freedom movement is trying to develop a moral stance against capitalism as a philosophy, as a way of life as well. How can we promote a different culture of being together? How can we actually, against the laws and the rules by the state, develop our own social contracts of what kind of moral, political, ecological and economical life can we have together? So Öcalan also says, for example, that capitalism is actually not an economy, it's anti-economy. He draws on the work of other people when he says that. But what it means is that above all, the desire here is to imagine in the here and now, but also actually build in the here and now a different way of relating to each other. So in this sense, the women's movement has taken a very, very important and active role in building up the revolution in Rojava. And the reason why people say this is a women's revolution is because there is not just a general system that is built, that is based generally on these principles that I've tried to describe, but at the same time, there is an autonomous women's system within that. So the women's struggle is not just a part of something ongoing. The women's struggle conceives of itself as actually the radical wing of everything. So in this sense, building autonomous spheres in which women can produce their own knowledge, in which women can create new forms of relating to each other as well in a patriarchal world in which women are constantly put in a position where they have to, where they are put as enemies of each other or rivals, or where they actually are always constantly exposed to the gaze of men and the violence. So what kind of spheres can women create in order to become the radical autonomous force that can be a driver, that can be the most revolutionary driver of the ongoing social revolution? So what I'm trying to say is that whilst there was an already organized movement, an organized structure with very experienced activists that has built up the movement, the revolution in Rojava. So we must not forget that this wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of people who didn't know each other. This is the outcome of 40 years of labor, of a very ideological movement and its perspectives and also leadership. But at the same time, it isn't just simply a top-down way of imposing radical values on people. So in this sense, the other friends will be able to describe much better now after me how getting radical principles such as ecology, women's liberation, and radical democracy not accepted, but actually embraced and developed by society itself. So the system in Rojava, above all, also tries to give people the tools of self-organization. The very act of coming together in neighborhood communes to decide on something that relates to one's everyday life is, for example, a very extremely liberating act in a society in which this was not possible, because decisions were tied to the state, and the state was tied to a party, and that party to the Assad family, for example, and the other contexts are similar. So I'm mindful that I'm already probably going over my time, but what I want to say is that the women's struggle is not just an aspect that many people have observed, especially through the figure of the women fighter, but we need to understand that the women's defense forces, the self-defense units, the political system that is being built in Rojava is actually the self-defense of a more deep, much more profound social revolution. And by that, again, it's not the case that people say, now we have liberated Rojava, but this is the beginning of a process to give people the tools to liberate themselves by giving people a chance to reflect and develop a consciousness for things, even if those things that they want to implement are not always possible in conditions of war and occupation. So in this sense, the women's movement, which has been building up all these autonomous academies, which have drafted women's social contracts, which are now also reaching out to different communities. So it's not at all just confined to Kurdish women, for example, the women's struggle in Rojava. The women's struggle actually makes what happens in Rojava much more universal, because it says patriarchy as the oldest form of oppression. If that does not get overcome, we cannot have a free society. So a free society is not a society that is able to do whatever it wants without anybody interfering in everyone's life, but rather an organized, politically literate society that can also defend itself against all forms of attacks. And for that, it's about creating new forms of understanding ourselves as communities, our relationship to nature, our relationship between the different communities, and also gender relations, of course. So many of you will know that since the Turkish occupations in Afrin and in other parts of Rojava, between Serikani and Tel Abyad, so the Turkish state has in the last 2-3 years several times invaded Rojava, because Rojava has been seen as a thorn in the eye of the Turkish state for many years now. Since the beginning of the Rojava revolution, the Turkish state has been planning on having a buffer zone in the northern region, and very often, as Blair also mentioned, 6 years ago when Daesh first started to besiege the city of Kobane, which is by now famous for having defeated the so-called Daesh Islamic State, was basically clear that for Erdogan, it was often more tolerable to have the so-called Islamic State at its border and not the system in Rojava. And here, again, this is something very, very crucial that few people are still paying attention to, is that the rise of Islamism, not just Daesh, but similar groups, Al-Qaeda remnants, those groups that are now currently, as has been just yesterday released in a UN report on the human rights situation in Syria, these groups that are being recruited by Turkey are systematically now attacking these communities. They have occupied entire regions. In the case of Afrin since 2018, an entire region. 300,000 people have been displaced, and the Peace Spring operation, which started almost exactly 1 year ago now, has again displaced a lot of people. But the main thing that we have seen among the first propaganda acts that these proxies of the Turkish state have been doing was to systematically attack women, is to execute, assassinate female politicians like Hevrin Khalaf. Now recently there was a drone attack that killed 3 Kurdish activists, women in Kobane. There's all these reports about systematic rape and kidnapping, sexual violence, trafficking, sexual slavery, all of these extremely well documented now war crimes and human rights abuses show us that the women's struggle as well was very much taken seriously by the enemies of the Rojava revolution, to the point that women are singled out and attacked, that women are the body of Barin Kobane, for example, was after her death mutilated and then filmed by these jihadist forces, who then circulated that as part of their propaganda. So I'll end here so that we can have more discussion later. But what I want to urge people to think about specifically is that this is basically a war that the Turkish state and its proxies are launching on women's historical gains against a movement that has inspired feminists and radicals around the world, for showing that also women's liberation is not something, is not a utopia. We can actually not just imagine, but in fact build a society in which violence against women is no longer normalized, especially in the Middle East context. Orientalist images make it seem like this is a region that is just condemned, that women just have to be oppressed. They have always been oppressed, they will always. But against this, the Kurdish women's movement said, no, this is not our history. The patriarchy is an outcome of a long system of oppression. And since it is a system, it's also a system that can be dismantled. And dismantling patriarchy is not only possible, but the condition for a free life. So in this sense, we need to all ask ourselves, what does it mean for a NATO army that gets money from the European Union to manage the so-called refugee crisis that this system is itself causing? Whilst there is a system like Rojava, where the different ethnic and religious communities, with all of their problems, of course, with the struggles and contradictions, whilst that kind of alternative exists, the world system deliberately chooses to side with the system that is currently represented by Turkey and its proxy forces that occupy parts of Rojava. What does it mean? What role do Western governments play in this game? What does it mean for the region as a whole? And especially, I always encourage women to think about it. What does it mean for the women's struggle? What does it mean for women's history today if we fail to defend the revolution in Rojava? It is in light of all of the states, heads of states, all of the patriarchal, sexist presidents that are destroying the lives of women around the world, we need to defend each other's revolutions and start seeing one revolution as everyone's revolution, because we're having shrinking alternatives. The spaces for radical organizing get smaller and smaller. So in this sense, really defending Rojava as a light on the horizon for so many people, with all of its contradictions. As I said, I don't want to romanticize or say everything is perfect. It's not perfect, but it is a system that is fundamentally believes that a system, that a society without violence, without oppression is possible. And this is something so precious that we need to defend it. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, Dilar. Yeah, there was so much that you said that was really powerful. I think, yeah, I loved how you articulated that the dismantling patriarchy is not only possible, but it's necessary for us to have a free life, to build this free life that the revolution is, yeah, has been trying to build practically on the ground. But in doing so, participating in the struggle, we decolonize our mind from state, from patriarchy, in kind of building these alternative systems, and all of this is necessary for a free life for everyone. So I'm going to hand over now to Viyan, who can maybe speak about their experiences doing some of this work on the grounds with the movement. Viyan.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you everybody. Good evening or good afternoon, maybe where you are. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Dilar. It's always a privilege to hear Dilar speak and be inspired and energized by it as well. I'm gonna try to kind of build off of what Dilar has been saying, especially this kind of idea of how do we, in rejecting fascism and patriarchy and capitalism, how do we build up a new philosophy, a new way of being, a new culture, and explore a couple of questions on that theme around what does an ecological framework to politics look like in Rojava, and how is that connected to the work that we do wherever we are all around the world. So as Katie mentioned in my introduction, before I spent a year in Rojava, I have been involved in about 15 years of ecological activism in North America and in the UK. And that involves both like kind of climate change campaigning, but also like working on the ground as a food grower in agroecology and community food growing. So when I went to Rojava, I brought a lot of sort of practical experience in ecological work, as well as a more theoretical awareness that, you know, ecology was linked to capitalism, to colonialism, to patriarchy, and kind of seeing as all of these as intersecting issues. But during my time in Rojava, and since then working with the Kurdish freedom movement more broadly, it really deepened my understanding of ecology, not just as an issue that's connected to lots of issues, but actually as like a framework, as an approach to politics and to society, which then also will fundamentally transform how we do ecology, if we see it not just as an issue, but an actual sort of philosophy, as an actual approach. And this is where I really think that there's a lot of resonance with social ecology and the wider theoretical framework that social ecology has produced for ecological struggles around the world. So I'm going to talk more specifically about sort of ecological projects and the environment in general in Rojava, because that's something that I came with a strong interest in and a strong focus on when I was in Rojava, but I will then try to build off of that and expand a little bit on a wider analysis of the revolution as a practice in an ecological framing of politics. So one thing that really struck me when I was in Rojava was how much the analytical understanding of the interconnectedness of ecological framing with lots of other issues was really put into practice. So for example, like within Aboriyajin, which is the Women's Economy Bureau, there were lots of projects which intertwined ecological agriculture or sort of recycling or industry with gender liberation, with a democratic cooperative economy, and really kind of blending that. And I remember in the UK, when climate was sort of folded into the business department of the government, we were all like, no, don't do that. But actually, like in Rojava, it makes sense because as Dilar mentioned, like the concept of economy is something that we as people should have ownership of, and it should be an ecological project. It's just that under the current state system, under the current governments, it's not. So that was kind of a bit of a wake-up call. And, you know, in every single element, transport, water, waste, economy, fossil fuels, agriculture, ecology is a current that runs throughout all of these different departments. And I was quite lucky in my work with the press center that I was working with when the sort of Turkish invasion was happening. And afterwards, I actually got to speak to a lot of these different all these different sort of municipal bureaus and say, well, what are you guys doing about ecology? And it was really, really amazing to hear every single one of them have these amazing, beautiful, inspirational, ambitious ideas for how to transform Rojava, Northeast Syria, into a sort of state-of-the-art ecological project in terms of recycling, in terms of grey water systems, in terms of eco-industrial projects, while at the same time, with the other hand, holding on to the practical realities of the embargo, no access to aid hardly, constant threat of attack, and so on. So it was really actually amazing to see that balancing and to see also that really intertwined nature of our ecology and also our autonomy, our self-defense, our philosophy. So that was really amazing to kind of also then see how a lot of people were able to see attacks on the natural world as attacks on the political project and the people, the communities that they were part of. So those were the projects of policies of deforestation and enforced monoculture that the Assad regime imposed on Rojava. Projects like the Hasan Cave Dam, which Turkey is enacting, that really devastate the ecology. So seeing that as something that is attacking not just the natural world, but us, not seeing that separation between the ecological world and us is really amazing. And so seeing how democracy and autonomy are crucial to ecology. So autonomous economy, autonomous energy systems, water management, village economies are all wrapped up into this question of like, what does it mean to be an ecological society? So the blending of these different issues, economy, ecology, self-defense, and so on, like means that there's quite a lot of different priorities, which are often in tension with each other: environment, economy, local autonomy, self-defense. So there's a lot of compromises or kind of contradictions. And, you know, kind of as Dilar said, like, it's not a utopia. Rojava definitely isn't like a ecological utopia at first glance, and especially through the Western gaze, the way that we're used to seeing ecology. You know, there's a lot of air pollution, there's a lot of plastic waste. You know, people often dispose of their trash by burning it with diesel oil, but at the same time, within the same space and within these same communities, some of the most radical solutions to climate change and ecological disaster in the world have become possible because the autonomous administration is able to weave ecology into its political and economic fabric, into the kind of longer term strategy. So projects like Cenî, the women's village, which combines gender liberation with a village economy with sustainable agriculture, lots of agricultural cooperatives and like long-term plans for recycling projects, show that there is this really amazing ability to balance the long-term perspective with the immediate needs held within the wider framework of what the movement's fighting for, which is, you know, the philosophy, the ideology that Dilar was referencing. So if we take that kind of framework of ecology and try to kind of make observations then, like, you know, to pivot and look at the revolutionary movement and what that ecological framework then looks like when we examine the revolutionary movement, for me, something that really struck me was how there's a role for everybody in the movement. You know, if you're a mother, a family, a head of family, a young person, a worker, an internationalist, as I was, a Christian, an Armenian, an Arab, a Kurdish, you know, grandmother, there is a role for you in the movement. And what the autonomous administration does is that it draws on these natural affinities and affiliations and it organizes them. It incorporates them into a democratic framework. So all professions, women, youth, religions, ethnicities are organized into a system of governments that enables groups to articulate collective needs and desires. And that process of creating that sense of a collective voice and also the development of a political culture in which people learn how to self-organize and meet their own needs is really the foundation of that revolutionary system, a lot more than the sort of superficial technicalities of how are delegates elected or how are decisions made. It really goes deeper than that into that philosophy, into that culture. Another aspect of the movement which demonstrates an ecological framework, it's the connection and interdependence even of the different strategies for making change. So in Western political scenes, sometimes like the most bitter political rivalries and schisms come out of these like big debates around tactics. You know, do we engage in electoral politics or do we not? Do we lobby decision makers or do we try to make the state irrelevant through like autonomous economies and autonomous democracy projects? Do we engage in militant self-defense tactics or do we not? And in the Kurdish freedom movement, you really see how all these different aspects support each other. So people who do engage in diplomacy work with the US, with Russia, with the Assad regime, they have to do that, but they try to affect change from within the system, but at the same time, they're intrinsically, intimately, and politically linked into the people who are community organizers, who are building up community power and nurturing the dynamism of a community in resistance to occupation, and a community which insists on its freedom and dignity. And then those who are in the military are focusing on the kind of physical reality of repelling attacks and protecting the people and the land, while at the same time also being linked into diplomatic structures. So you really see this like accountability between all of these different arenas of what political action can look like. And as Dilar mentioned, these are all forms of self-defense. So in Rojava, society is creating new ways of defending itself, defense of land, defense of community, defense of, you know, people, freedom, dignity, and they all coordinate with each other and communicate with each other in a way which is, I couldn't even begin to imagine coming from a UK context, while at the same time having a huge amount of autonomy in how they actually carry out their work. So how does that connect to us and the work that we do wherever we are? And how do we apply this sort of ecological lens to the work that we do as activists or political organizers in Europe or North America or wherever we are? So if we see ecology as like a framework or as a worldview and not just as an issue, it actually means that we can't just think of the work that we do like, as an activist, as an organizers, because actually we're doing it as workers, as carers, as mothers, as siblings, as churchgoers, as members of amateur sports teams, as, you know, people who go, you know, play bingo every Sunday night or whatever, right? We're bringing actually all of ourselves to this, and we bring our politics to every arena that we live in. We don't compartmentalize things into little different sections. And the way that we stop this from being overwhelming, the way that we stop ourselves from just trying to do everything is through organization. And for me, maybe some of you are familiar with kind of permaculture framings of things. And there's this phrase in permaculture that's everything gardens. It's kind of one of the principles of permaculture. And what that refers to is how ecological systems within themselves maintain through a series of systems and relationships, which are both like individually fulfilling, but also serve a collective purpose. So for example, like a bee going from a blossom to a blossom is serving its own need for food, for gathering pollen, while at the same time, you know, pollinating the tree, which then can produce fruit, which feeds animals, which then feed the soil through human waste, and also through, you know, decomposition, which then feeds the soil, which then feeds the tree, and like the cycle begins all over again. So I really think it's useful to think of the political work that we do in this kind of ecological framework. We all contribute to a greater whole, and each project that we're involved in is connected by countless threads to others in like really small ways, but also in global ways. So, you know, through this, we kind of reject that sort of subject-object separation that we often fall into, which, you know, again, really resonates with social ecology. But it's really easy to fall into that framework if, you know, you're all the way in the UK and you're looking at Rojava and you're thinking, well, how do I support what's happening over there? This other thing that's happening, which is actually kind of very different from what's happening here. We need to really break down that kind of binary divide and really see ourselves as part of that movement in different ways, and doing that both in ways we articulate publicly, we internally remind ourselves through the education that we do. And we need to see our relationship to Rojava as being part of a global resistance and see it through this ecological framework. And at the same time, recognize how Rojava is unique because it shows a way. It gives an example of what's possible, and it also strengthens us. So its very existence is a blow against capitalism. It's a blow against patriarchy and fascism. But it can't exist in isolation. You know, it's connected to the democratic and federalist movement across all of Kurdistan, across all of Europe and around the world, which means it's also connected, you know, our lives here are connected to the Turkish attacks on Rojava, the Turkish attacks on Iraqi Kurdistan, both in a philosophical, ideological way, and also in the fact that, you know, the countries that we live in sell weapons to Turkey, which are then used to destroy and stage assaults on the project in Rojava. So seeing ourselves in this kind of bigger picture and connecting our own fights for freedom, for dignity, and for democracy in our countries to the fights which are being fought in north and east Syria. So It's something that we need to do practically, like emotionally, philosophically, ideologically, in order to chip away at the institutions of capitalism and the state and patriarchy and fascism that we're confronted by, like in our communities, and learn from the Kurdish freedom movement and strengthen it where we can as well. And I guess my sort of concluding call would be to encourage you to not be too analytical or academic about how you interact with the question of, you know, social ecology in Rojava, but really bring your heart into it, like bring your rage and your anger into it, and also your hope. So see it as a situation not to observe and analyze, but something that you're actually part of, because, you know, having spent a year there, like the friends in Rojava, they do see all of us as part of the movement. They don't see us as those people over there who kind of support us. They really see us as comrades, no matter where we are all over the world. So I think, you know, it's up to all of us to step up to that and step into those shoes and do what we can to fight for the revolution wherever we are, however we can.
Thank you so much, Viyan. That was lovely. Argesh is our next guest. Just have to find you. Argesh, are you with us?
I am, yeah.
Lovely, thank you. The floor is yours.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thanks to the ISE and all the friends here presented. And thank you for inviting me to contribute to this conference. And it's a tough discussion to follow up because we covered so many points so well and with such an ideological perspective that now I get to speak about security, which, you know, doesn't have the most ideological aspects to it, but I will try and put it in an ideological framework. But if we're talking about an access, first I should probably introduce myself actually. I'm Argesh. I've been with YPG since 2017. I was in Raqqa, Afrin, and again in not Syrian until September. And in the last few years, I've been working more on the security side and focused on intelligence technology and doing kind of that side of work with the movement and specifically with the YPG and the anti-terror. And so that's kind of my story, and been back and forth between Europe and Rojava over the last few years. So I think a good point to start with would be the more physical threats. So if we look at the history of the Rojava Revolution, we can see that in the beginning that there were a number of different actors, and we can see the state versus the non-state actors. And so as the conflict has developed, the major state actors were the US-led coalition, primarily the United States, Turkey, obviously the primary adversary of Rojava and the Autonomous Administration, SDF, Russia, Iran, who are both supporting the Assad regime, and with whom we have a more neutral sort of relationship. But in the last few years, we've seen the threat shift from non-state actors such as Daesh or ISIS and other jihadist groups to more direct threats from state actors via proxy forces. So you would see this through the Turkish invasions in 2016, in Afrin in 2018, and again in Cenî in 2019. And with the shift towards the state actors being more directly involved as a sort of center of our threat, we see a lot more of an existential threat posed to Northeast Syria and to the Rojava Revolution, because rather than fighting jihadist groups or militias with the support of the coalition, where we have, you know, this air support and technology and intelligence supporting operations on the ground, we are now in the opposite role, where we are facing the NATO technology, where we are facing not only brutal jihadist groups and proxies supported by the Turkish state, but we're also facing them when they're supported by all this, the NATO technology and actual Turkish regular army forces. So this is kind of the situation that we're faced with now, where the biggest threat is coming from Turkey. And while we have sort of a continuous tension with the regime and with the Iranian proxy forces, they tend to maintain a sort of uneasy neutrality with us. So I would assert again that the Turkish state is the main threat to the northeast Syria and Rojava. And that being said, we can look at the threat from Turkey in a number of ways. Obviously, the most direct one is through the physical force, and the vast majority of the power comes from the drone program, which has been developed by Seljuk Bayraktar and Bayraktar Industries, which is a Turkish industry. And before 2012, I think Turkey was primarily relying on the United States, Israel, and some other Western countries for their drone programs. And since the development of the Bayraktar program, Turkey has massively increased its independence, and rather than being relying on Western drones, and with the Western drones, they have a contract which restricts the usage of these drones. Turkey can now develop their own drones, develop their own weapon systems to support those drones, and use them as they wish. So we can see with the development of the Bayraktar drone program, they have become much more effective in targeting the Kurdish movement as a whole, but also specifically in Rojava. So as long as hostilities continue, that will be the main point of the, oh, sorry, I just see a question. Someone said the name of the Turkish drone program is Bayraktar. Oh, thank you. And so as long as that program is continuing, and as long as hostilities are continuing, the main security threat is actually from the Turkish drones, because they limit our ability, our defense forces, to move, and they have the ability to track our movements through signals intelligence, such as Wi-Fi or cell phone usage or infrared signals. There's a whole range of ways they can track us, and as long as we cannot move, then we cannot effectively defend. So it poses a major threat from a security perspective. And we can say that without the Turkish support, most of their proxy forces, like I think they're now called the Syrian National Army. Before they were the Free Syrian Army, and before that they were Al-Nusra, Daesh, and Al-Qaeda. We know that they're not a very effective fighting force without the Turkish air support. So we can see that as a main factor. If we are able to remove that, if we are able to remove direct involvement by the Turkish military, not only would we be able to effectively defend northeast Syria and Rojava, but we would potentially even be able to liberate the areas like Cenî, Tel Abyad, Idrisbiye, or potentially Afrin as well, because this is the main point is because they enjoy the support of Turkish air power that we cannot actually effectively move forward or really effectively defend. And so I think from a political point of view, we ask, okay, what can you do? What can you do about Turkey developing such a powerful drone program? Well, the best thing you could do is push for a no-fly zone over Rojava, like the coalition had done in Bashur in Iraqi Kurdistan. At the end of the second Iraq war, they established a no-fly zone and effectively blocked Turkey from being able to push into Bashur, Iraqi Kurdistan. So that could be something to consider from a political perspective as a realistic option to counter the Turkish air power and counter, well, effectively Turkish air supremacy, and ensure that Rojava will be able to effectively defend itself in the future. So when we look at the physical threat, we see the drones, right? But the biggest threat, I think now, when there's not a full-scale operation going on, is the vast amount of state surveillance, electronic surveillance that's going on in the region. So in that case, it's not just Turkey anymore, but we have Russia, Iran, the United States, all the coalition members, in addition to Turkey, which are operating a very intense electronic surveillance program in northeast Syria. And from that kind of surveillance, they can glean information about virtually every aspect of daily life, of work, of sensitive information from both the civilian and the military side of the self-administration and self-defense forces. And it seems daunting at first, especially when we consider the budgets that we're faced with. You know, we see the US as the Department of Defense, the State Department, the CIA, all the intelligence agencies, which is a massive budget supporting specifically electronic surveillance. And we have obviously a budget that is a small fraction of that. And again, you see in Turkey, part of their strategy was to invest their resources into their drone and air superiority programs, in addition to hacking, in addition to electronic surveillance. So you see also Russia, which has a very competent and powerful electronic surveillance program, and we've seen how they've managed to manipulate elections. So you can imagine what their capabilities would be on northeast Syria. And of course, Iran, which also invests a large amount of their defense budget into electronic surveillance to be used to monitor the population in order to suppress and oppress political opposition groups. So basically what they've done is they've taken that technology and used it to observe and surveil northeast Syria so everyone can understand what we're doing at all times. And while it seems a bit depressing to hear all this stuff, there is actually a number of relatively simple solutions that have been developed by a number of activists in the open source technology communities. And these kind of programs are available and they're relatively easy to use, and they can provide us with the security that we need. They're free, open source is free. And so basically we can look at what would be a call to action for this kind of stuff, and we can ask for comrades from around the world to help with the development and training and suggestions for different open source software that can ensure privacy. Because I think if we're talking about the future for Rojava and northeast Syria, we have to take seriously I try to find the right words for this, but the sovereignty of our information. We have to protect our information. And although we may be allied with the US-led coalition, at the same time, we have to be sure to be able to protect the information, because it's part of our, from the ideological perspective. Information is the same as, it's a part of privacy, and I think, it's a fundamental rights and freedom that we shouldn't be able to give up all that kind of information to any state actor that wishes to impose. And again, it's also a form of sort of neo-colonial approach, that we're here, therefore we're entitled to take all your information. But to continue on that thread, the technological side, the security of our information faces a serious threat, again, from Turkey, because they have continued to carry out a number of hacks and attacks, electronic attacks on targeting not only Bakur, Bashur, and some European countries, but specifically Rojava. And from these attacks, they're able to install malware on our computers, on our tablets, and on most Android phones. And from that, they can glean information to help not only build files for intelligence, but also to generate targets for assassinations, like we see across Kurdistan. That kind of information is used to inform drone attacks that we've seen the movement has been plagued with in all 4 parts of Kurdistan. And so I think at the moment, the biggest threat would be electronic surveillance. Of course, the physical threat always exists. Turkey does, in fact, pose an existential threat to northeast Syria and Rojava. And as long as the drone program goes unchecked, and as long as they are unchecked by all of the state actors involved in the Syrian conflict, they will pose a serious threat because they have air supremacy over our forces. So I think that would kind of wrap up the external threats. Of course, from an internal perspective, we also face some threats. And again, this subject is not intended, it's intended to give you information to be realistic, but not to be totally depressing. So internally, we're also facing a threat from the state actors. There's an external threat that's manipulating the internal everyday interactions. So for example, in the largely tribal areas to the south, in, for example, Deir ez-Zor, there are a number of state actors that are actually trying to manipulate the tribal groups in order to win influence over the region. And this is what's called the tribal engagement tactics. And what they'll do is use either financial assets or promises of land, of agricultural assets, a number of different things based on the conversations they have with tribal leaders to try and coerce them to support each state actor's larger strategy. And I think we've seen an intensified effort in the last 6 months to the last year of both Russia, Iran, and the United States trying to manipulate tribal groups in order to affect their strategies for the region. And this also goes in line with the US policy, which was developed by a think tank, I think in 2014. And the idea was to try and pull the payday away from the Kurdish movement, from the ideology of Öcalan, and to pull the SDF away from PYD and YPG, so that they would be much closer to the United States and sort of mirror the kind of government that exists in the KRG, like the KDP, Barzani style sort of federal capitalist government that exists in Bashur, that's very close to Israel and the United States, and very dependent, more importantly, on the United States. So I think from an ideological point of view, this is a threat that we will continue to be faced with in the coming years, especially since Serikani, since the invasion of Serikani, which sort of pushed the movement in northeast Syria into a very vulnerable state, where it was necessary to quickly negotiate and engage in diplomacy in order to prevent further advances from the Turkish army. And I think this is another aspect that we'll have to continue to struggle against, and something that we have to keep refreshing and remembering, that the movement in Rojava, the autonomous administration is built on the fundamentals of democratic federalism, and we have to keep self-criticizing and doing that in order to ensure that that we're not compromising the fundamental ideals of this movement. But again, I think that will be also another threat, because as time goes on, And if Turkey makes another invasion or operation in northeast Syria, again, it could put us in a vulnerable position unless there's a no-fly zone, unless we're able to find some sort of solutions to the Turkish air supremacy or all this manipulation that's going on by external state actors. And I hope that wasn't too mixed up, but I think we have Thomas from RIC here. And if we have time, I think Thomas can give a much more concrete, data-driven, and factual-based assessment of the security situation, because I know the RIC publishes a number of really in-depth reports on Daesh, on tribal groups in Deir ez-Zor in the south, and on the Turkish state's and Turkish military's actions in northern Syria.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? Yeah, thank you Argesh for that, and hi to Argesh, to Viyan, to Dilar, all of whom I have the pleasure to know, and yeah, some personally, some online, and yeah, when we're talking about how wide this movement is and what different people it attracts to support it and to work with it and for it, then these three people are a really good illustration. Yes, I mean, like, I guess what I really wanted to say was somehow to draw together a bit what Argesh was saying and what Viyan was saying in particular. And then a bit, you know, you have on the one side this, as what Dilar said, is sometimes almost a utopic vision of what's happening here in north and east Syria. And then you have these security threats, you have the drones, you have the instability in the tribal areas. And so, yeah, like how these two things fit together. And sometimes I think there's a bit of a, it can be a bit of a sort of a simplistic narrative that's almost a get out of jail free card. That's like, oh, well, we would have built more democracy here if it wasn't for all these attacks, if it wasn't for ISIS, if it wasn't for Turkey. Obviously, there is an element of truth in that, but yeah, I mean, I know Öcalan himself also says that it's not enough to keep making excuses, particularly, for example, in developing the women's revolution, and that we have to act according to the opportunities that we have now. And you can actually see that in a way, some of these pressures that Argesh was describing are contributing to the development of new forms of democracy here in north and east Syria. So, yeah, like particularly in the last period, as Argesh said, then there's been, particularly in this region, Deir ez-Zor, which is the southern region of north and east Syria, recently liberated from ISIS. There's very severe security problems. ISIS continue to assassinate people on pretty much a daily basis down there, particularly people working with the administration. Turkey is also trying to drive the same thing, and of course the Syrian regime is also making pressure, and all of these actors are trying to pull these conservative Arab tribespeople away from the administration and the Kurdish movement and say, hey, come with us, or at least resist what's happening there, don't accept this new system. And in different ways as well, like both militarily, as Argesh said, and also in terms of exerting humanitarian and political pressure. Many actors are really trying to separate out the Kurdish and the Arabic communities in particular here in north and east Syria. And so what does this mean for the democratic project here? So yeah, and this also I'm reminded of what Viyan was saying about how this movement can kind of draw together this diplomatic approach on the one side and this very radical approach on the other side, and actually these two feed off each other and strengthen one another. And so in response to particularly this killings and this unrest in Deir ez-Zor, there have been protests in this region, Arab people protesting, saying we don't feel represented, we don't feel protected. And of course here in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, normally what would be the answer to that would be you come in with a machine gun and you mow them all down, right? The administration has reacted differently. They have launched a series of consultations across north and east Syria, so in part responding to this particular situation in this region, Deir ez-Zor, but also responding more generally to these efforts to divide the Kurds and the Turks, the Kurds and the Arabs, sorry, to spread fear, to try and promote a greater sense of community. And so these meetings are like kind of consultations. They're a chance for people, for political actors, for civil society actors to feed back to the administration to say, this is what's working, this is not working. So I was at one of these meetings like, a few days ago, and here you of course have people from the administration. You also have people from these, the more conservative Arab tribes. You have the Kurdish nationalist opposition, you have the women's movement, you have representatives of the youth movement, you have people that are closer to the Syrian regime. So it's a big mix of people that you wouldn't normally expect to see under the same roof. And through this process, there's a chance for people, both to feed in their views into the political process and also to criticize and address the administration for their kind of practical grievances. So, I mean, the things that were being said, it was struggles with getting enough food, struggles with getting enough work, and concerns about the security situation in particular. On the same side, just the fact that all these people are there in the same building is something I think really amazing. And there was also, a common sense, at least from those in the room, that despite the criticisms that people might have of the administration, they really see them as the best option and highly preferable for sure to a return of the regime, for example, to these regions, highly preferable, of course, to the murderous arrival of Turkish-backed forces in this region. And so like this, you can see that, the way the administration approaches these questions and these pressure, it also helps to produce forms of democracy. Of course, so here in Rojava, for example, like just to analyze a bit the last few years, of course, there's been this idea of the communes, as the building blocks of this revolution. And certainly, according to my observations, then it's not really in the communes where you really see this democracy coming up from the ground. It's happening on kind of like slightly wider level than that in terms of the participation of these, community groups, in terms of like, particularly actually in Arab regions where Arab people have said, we want to do things differently to how the wider movement sees it. And the movement said, okay, we respect that, you can do things your way. Or in terms of the women, like requesting a particular change to a particular policy, for example. And so, I mean, what you see here is maybe not exactly the same direction that the Rojava revolution started in, but also a form of, we can say grassroots democracy, also a form of listening to people and hearing what they have to say and coming to them where they are, which I think is extremely radical and which is kind of also still in the process of being developed. That's also what's being discussed in this whole process is, how are these Arab tribes going to fit into this vision here? And I think I saw someone in the comments was also talking about the question of, like if the Kurds are having like preferential treatment within this system. I think, it's a difficult question, which maybe we don't have time to get into now, but that whole process, that meeting is part of the answer that, you have these people gathered together, speaking, of course, in Arabic, which remains the lingua franca of this region. You have these Arab sheikhs quoting the Quran to in support of the movement. And so maybe you might first think of this like older Arab guy like quoting the Quran when they think of democracy here in Rojava, but that's also one way that it can look like. And so I think despite all these pressures, that's something very hopeful and very positive that the movement manages to show that.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It was great additional context and information. We've received a ton of fantastic questions here. It's hard to keep track of them all, but I think maybe just randomly, if we could, and it's going to be a little difficult to track everyone down and unmute you and whatnot, so I think we're probably just going to read them for you. Apologies just for, purely technical reasons. But one that I think is a nice, maybe more hopefully inspirational question, and one I haven't heard before from Dorian Wallace, is what is the state of the creative arts within Rojava? And that wasn't for any particular speaker, so I will unmute all of our speakers here if they're not already.
I think Viyan should answer that question.
Thanks. I certainly don't have like a comprehensive analytical sort of perspective on it, but you know, one thing I can say is that there's a lot of kind of, I guess, creative arts. There's like you know, film collectives, there's a lot of dance collectives, there's a lot of kind of reclaiming and reconnecting with sort of the local heritage of all the different communities across the region, whether they're Kurdish or Armenian or Assyrian or Turkmen, and kind of bringing in aspects of language, which, you know, I think is really connected when it comes to sort of song and literature and so on, you know, the kind of making it possible for all children to be taught in their mother tongue in a way that it wasn't under the Assad regime. So I think that's a really important milestone that's happened in Rojava, this kind of like official acceptance and celebration of different cultures in terms of that kind of facet of creativity and art and so on. From, I guess, yeah, like a personal experience point of view, you know, there were like, you know, free film showings, opera, yeah, like plays that I went to with friends when I was in Rojava, and it really, you know, it was in many ways, it felt like community theater blended with, you know, professional performance. There was a really wonderful intersection of kind of students doing their things and like a lot of experimental stuff, but also people who are, you know, professional opera singers, professional performers, all coming in together and all piling into the same community hall in order to have this performance. And then afterwards, quite often there'd be like feedback from the audience, and people would all chip in and analyze the performance and say what they thought about how the director chose to direct this theater piece. So it was a really interesting sort of yeah, like seeping in the political culture, blending with the creative arts in some ways. I think it's also then useful to recognize that, for example, the Rojava Film Commune, which was a collective that produced a lot of music and video and films, you know, was based in Serikanya, which is now occupied by Turkish-backed forces. So there is also a real, yeah, destruction of the creative arts through the occupation, and it's also through art that we resist. So you see a lot of amazing, yeah, music and film and poetry and writing come out as part of that kind of political resistance to the occupation. So yeah, those are some of my reflections. Some lovely graffiti as well.
Thanks, Viyan. Do any of the other speakers want to come in on that? No, I'm just looking at the video. Okay, so again, like Blair said, we've had lots of questions in the chat. So there are a few kind of more, there's quite a few sort of technical ones about going into more depth about the political situation right now, and some of the things that Argesh in particular spoke about. So I'm just going to pull out some more general ones about Rojava and society for now. So from Alice, there's a question about incarceration in Rojava and when and how this is used. And I guess like any of you might be able to speak about yeah, prison and abolition and that kind of attitudes to this sort of thing.
Anyone want to take that one? See Viyan's hand up there.
I was actually going to say if Thomas from the Rojava Information Center will be up for fielding this one. They have done quite a lot of research on some aspects of this.
Lovely. Thomas, please.
Hi, yeah, sure. So incarceration is an interesting question because, you know, there was this thing which is often quoted from the early days of the revolution. There was this statistic that Rojava has the lowest level of incarceration of any nation state, if it were a nation state on the face of the planet per capita. Obviously, what you've also got now is there was this war against ISIS, and famously you have these, you know, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dedicated jihadis in prison here. So it's kind of the situation, in a sense, therefore has completely flipped. And again, there you see some of the difficulties in putting into practice some of these ideals on the ground, and the way you have to work with them, adapt them. And so what I would say my principal observation on this point is that the main reforms here occur before you arrive to incarceration. So that there's more of a, I would say there's more of a reform, particularly in the judicial system, than there is in incarceration per se, or in policing per se, which is to say that the prisons here look quite a lot like prisons, albeit that the guards are generally very nice and jolly, at least in my experience, and albeit that there are some programs in there, but they are, you know, they are prisons, and quite likely if you were to shoot someone, there's a chance that you might go to prison and you would stay there for some years. But what is kind of different is the way that people might end up there. So there's a lot of different routes here that justice can be solved, like really on the community level. And what is also important to remember here is that, particularly in the culture here, if some years ago, if, for example, I had a dispute with you, a property dispute, then it's quite likely that rather than, or particularly a dispute about a woman, or if I were a woman that had offended you in some way, rather than going to prison, then you would come and you would shoot me in the head with the shotgun that you keep in your house. And so these new justice mechanisms are ways that try to resolve, both stop putting people in prison, but also stop these blood feuds, and particularly on killings. And so you have these structures, which some of you may have heard of, particularly the women's houses, which try to solve these questions around, like honor killings, divorce disputes, and so on, which so often end in bloodshed here, but also other issues that women might face. And then you have the reconciliation committees, which might look more at property disputes and property crime, which are other kind of big drivers of violence and crime here in the region. And then you might also have discussions within your local commune as well. And then what you also might have is, on the more community level, there's something like a platform, so a discussion in a particular town, a particular community, if a crime did occur, about what should be the outcome. So all of these routes, like there's stuff written about them online, these platforms, women's houses, reconciliation committees, and these are all ways in which the community here and the administration here tries to stop people from arriving to prison in the first place. But yeah, at the same time, like with prisoners, then the real kind of headline is that you have these thousands of ISIS suspects who are being tried in what is like a pretty reasonably fair justice system for the locals. But yeah, at the moment, if they are found guilty of having been in ISIS, you do go to prison because, you know, they were in ISIS. And the administration has some programs, rehabilitation programs that it's working on, but they're desperately underfunded, desperately understaffed. This is something I think that they would really like to do more on, and hopefully will do more on in the future, but it's a colossal problem which needs massive, massive international support to deal with these, particularly ISIS members that they now have detained here in the region.
Thanks, Thomas. Dilar, you'd like to add to that?
Yes, yeah, just to add to what Thomas has already mentioned, and this partly relates also to what Viyan said about the situation of culture and art, is it's very difficult for people to learn ways of developing their own perspectives and their own practices of doing things without reliance on the state. And it automatically often sometimes tends to be that people wait for somebody to come and do the task of either separating a feuding party or you know, interfering in a way that is external. But I think part of what makes the justice system in Rojava so interesting is to ensure that communities, like in the first level, it's the communities themselves through these committees that are in charge of like reconciliation, peacemaking, to kind of solve these problems, and only then to go further into the abstract. So it's, in a way, it's the opposite of much of the kind of, yes, as Thomas said, due to the situation on the ground, you have to have security. You cannot just kind of expect people to do everything in this very spontaneous and random way. And this is why this principle of organizing justice as well, right? So like when saying there are ways of solving issues in society in a more transformative way, that's where the women's movement actually plays quite an important role, because you cannot abolish things like prisons, the police. These are things that are very much on the agenda of many people today, especially in light of all of the racist police violence that we're seeing in the US and elsewhere. But what happens is that you cannot abolish systems and institutions like that without also transforming society. So I think in this sense, the Kurdish women's movement's perspective is quite close in that sense to the tradition of Black abolitionist feminists, for example, who say we can, like when we say prison abolitionism, we actually also mean abolishing violence inside society. And what does that mean is to transform the mentality of patriarchy that normalizes this kind of violence on such a basic level. So all of these things, they need to be considered together, that you cannot have a different kind of justice-seeking system without also having a new perspective on arts and culture as a vehicle for social transformation, without also an education system in which people learn how to not take revenge on another community, but how to actually live together after having survived several systems that have pitted all these communities together. So there needs to be a lot of healing, and this is why people speak primarily also not about just a kind of bureaucratic or like an institutional change, like getting rid of this and then establishing something else, but what's the logic that informs everything you do? And I think this is very important to consider, especially for people to understand that Rojava isn't just a perfect blueprinted system that just was installed. The very idea of democratic autonomy as proposed by the movement is that it should be flexible, is that it should walk with society, it should consult society in every step of the way, which is why, for example, when speaking about the women's laws that were passed in Rojava very early on, that also was a result of a consultation process that the women's movement, together with different committees, did. They went from commune to the assemblies, and they consulted the women on what kind of a system they wanted. And then at the same time as passing them, there were a lot of educational activities. So you can't just say, we have women's laws now, on paper, women get respected in this system, if the society doesn't accept it. So you need to change society for them to also kind of be prepared to understand the logic of systems like the co-presidency system, autonomous women's structures, and so on. And so when it comes to the non-majority Kurdish areas as well, in Manbij, for example, I had the chance to visit Manbij 2 years ago as part of a trip there. Again, women were saying the society has survived ISIS. People have seen so many traumatic things. You can't just come and implement exactly the same system that we have been working on in Rojava based on a very, very long history of organizing along revolutionary principles. You can't just, it's not like that. Society doesn't function this way. So this is why it's important to really do the educational work alongside the economic empowerment of people, like based on their own kind of alternatives that they develop themselves. So these things all come together. And here again, the role of art and culture is very important. And there is also an autonomous women's culture movement called Kevana Zerin, which especially also works on questions around what kind of an autonomous media do we need? What's the role of media, for example, in changing the language in which we report about questions like violence against women? So it's about denormalizing violence also in people's minds. It's not just about saying we have the YPG now, and now women are free. It doesn't work like that. And I think this is this kind of slow radicalism of the Kurdish movement that enables communities over time, because the argument is of Öcalan and the movement in general is that these values are not abstract ideals that you need to teach society. In fact, solidarity, cooperation, kind of horizontal relations, they are actually at the heart of what makes society, what makes community. It's capitalism and patriarchy and systems of hierarchy and oppression that alienate us from these values. So actually saying we can have a different society often very much resonates with existing communal practices. It's just about updating them to new conditions.
Thanks so much, Dilar. So just keeping an eye on time, we have about 20 minutes left and we have a ton of fantastic questions. So I apologize, we're probably not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to select next a couple from Laura Schliefer. First question is whether you all think the US election will affect the situation in Rojava anyway, and if so, how? And second, if there is any significant support, solidarity for Kurdish liberation within either the Syrian or Turkish populations. Wasn't specified for whom, so. Or Iraqi population. Viyan, Thomas, anyone want to take a shot at that one? Argesh? Argesh. You can unmute yourself.
Sorry, I tried to unmute, but I don't know what was happening. Okay, I can answer part one for sure. I can maybe make some comments about the second question, more about the Turkish support for the Kurdish movement. As for Syrian population, I don't know if I would have the correct information to answer that effectively. But part one about the U.S. election, I think it does have a large effect on the potential for an operation by Turkey. Before a few months ago, maybe before the last year, I would have guessed that Turkey would be likely to make an operation before the US election because they knew that the US would be unlikely to take any action, anything that they would deem risky action in the midst of an election. So that would offer a large opportunity for Turkey or for anyone involved in the Syrian conflict to take action without fear of a US response. And I think from the last few months, it's less the case, but I think again for a Turkish operation. Sorry, is that okay? Maybe it was something. I'm just hearing something. But it does offer a good opportunity. I think the timing of it, especially just before the U.S. election, now that the media has died down from Serikani and Telabiad, that the timing is very, very good for a Turkish operation. So if they were to make it, now would be the time. However, we can always watch the media. Turkey is typically very loud about an operation. Before they make an operation, the rhetoric that builds up for 2 or 3 months before others, especially from the US. And I think, again, the US election, the result of the US election will also have a large effect on how things will play out. Because I think if we have another 4 years of Trump as president of the United States, then that could embolden Russia and Turkey, especially Turkey as the president of the United States. However, if Biden were to win the election, he said throughout his campaign that he would increase support to the SDF in Northeast Syria. However, as I'm sure you've all seen throughout the election, Biden is questionable on his sort of state of mind, I think. But that being said, if Biden were to be elected president of the United States, I think there would be a return to a more predictable sort of liberal Obama, where there would be a very predictable approach in Northeast Syria rather than following the more erratic approach that the Trump administration's had. And in the end, I think the Biden administration, if he were to win the election, would probably be, for better or worse, the more secure, the more I don't know what the word is, because it's really not good for anyone to have either of these guys as presidents, but I think Biden as the president of the United States would be somewhat better for the administration of Northeast Syria.
Thanks, Argesh. And you were kind of cutting out, and there was some delay. So maybe for the next questions, we could maybe turn off your video just so we could hear you better. Would be great.
Okay.
Viyan wanted to that, and then Chris has a question.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to give sort of a brief input on the question around the US elections. So as Argesh said, there is this kind of like two evils sort of situation where actually like both of these powers, like we're under no illusions that, you know, the US is suddenly going to become, you know, a savior and a kind of actually fully, truly embracing, you know, the radical politics, the revolutionary politics of the Kurdish freedom movement. And so I think it's just important to keep that in mind, and then also kind of reflecting on what I was saying before, not take this really distant approach where I hear a lot of questions in seminars that we give, which are like, what will happen if this happens? You know, how likely is this thing to happen? Is it we want some kind of like really quantifiable like series of events so we know what we can expect before we then like get involved? And I would just really kind of maybe encourage people to say, well, what can I do to affect that outcome? You know, like politics is something that is all of us. It's not just this abstract thing that happens theoretically, like separated from us. Like, so the question really shouldn't be, you know, what's going to happen if Biden wins or if Trump wins, but how are we going to respond as social movements? A lot of you guys are in the USA and actually are very well placed to, you know, push for the perspective and the course of action that you believe in, that you know is right, like regardless of who wins the election.
Thanks, Viyan. Is there anyone else that wanted to make some comments? Dilar.
Just very briefly, I mean, just to reiterate what Viyan has said, this dilemma, Biden or Trump. Let's remember that back in 2014, I think it was Joe Biden, at the time vice president. He said our closest allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, have contributed to the rise of Islamism in the region by either directly or indirectly, and then he apologized. So let's remember that a lot of the policies, Middle East policies that we're still struggling with in the region at the moment are a product, an outcome, direct outcome of the Obama administration during Joe Biden's time. And so there is also not really a big reason to think that Joe Biden, you know, despite he's now playing this figure of the liberal who's on the side of the oppressed, he's not. He's one of the most reactionary people that we can expect to become heads of state of the world. So in that sense, this actually brings back exactly what the system of Rojava and any social alternative represents today, is a refusal to say, to pick between two. Yes, there are elections. Yes, people will vote. There will be an outcome that will affect people. So it's not irrelevant. People's election behaviors are not irrelevant. However, that is one aspect out of many other sides of political struggle. It's important and this is why the Kurdish movement says today, we need to liberate ourselves from this idea that we confine our struggles to nation-state borders when everything is so connected. I mean, the question of ecology itself, nation-states provincialize issues that are planetary, and the planet is burning. And arms companies, states, they have these transnational links with each other. And so basically the system, whether it's fascism, whether it's authoritarianism, whatever we may qualify it as, is organized. So it's time for social movements to also engage in common struggles, so that, in fact, people don't have to pick these between these two alternatives. It's not to say that it will not matter. It will matter whether it's Biden or Trump, but both are bad. So accepting that, what can we do? How can we organize ourselves? How can we raise more and more awareness? And also always connect the idea that, you know, Turkey's attacks on Rojava are not this is not Turkey's own making. There's groups of states that work together and they have common ideologies. And I think one important aspect here is also the rise and the normalization of Islamism in the region, and people on the left also need to be able to find a language to talk about it without fearing to come across as there is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is very much real, but the way out of that is not to normalize Islamism as part of Middle East culture. So in this sense, I think these things are very important for us to understand, and I think this is what Rojava stands for. It came out in a situation in the context of the Arab Spring where people were resisting for different issues. Ultimately, people can say they were struggling for freedom, but it's so easy for struggles to be co-opted. It's so easy for struggles to be attacked and marginalized. So how can we come out stronger through autonomous self-organization without reliance? And this is exactly what the women's movement's primary kind of principle is about. How do we not trust in the change within men, but how can we develop ourselves in the here and now with the prospect that we can actually change society? So in this sense, the movement itself doesn't trust in either Trump or Biden, and we should also not tie ourselves, our fates to elections. We need to take them seriously. We need to acknowledge that they exist, but this is not, we are actors of politics, as Viyan said, and we have the very fact that with the Afrin invasion and also this Peace Spring operation, for example, it started with so many people on the ground everywhere around the world. When Kobane was besieged 6 years ago, people around the world actually forced an international reaction. We need to always acknowledge that. Before the US conducted airstrikes on Kobane, it was the resistance on the ground, and it was massive international organization, solidarity, and that's increasing more and more. And I think this is what really needs to happen. The women's struggle, for example, is the most kind of grassroots. It's the biggest movement today in the world. It's one of the most active and most radical movements in the world. Not the Kurdish. I mean, I'm talking about global women's struggles are on the rise. So that's where we need to put our energy as social movements, anyway.
Blair, am I unmuted?
You are.
Yeah, okay, I was gonna kind of do a composite question, and it will tie back into what Dilar just said. Questions that from N, Lucas, and Paul, basically addressed to all the panelists, but again, tying into what Dilar said. With the things that are going on, we've heard the security concerns that Thomas and Argesh mentioned. What, apart from what we wish and what we hope, what do we see coming in the future for Rojava and the revolution? Are we looking at some sort of reintegration with the Syrian state under some sort of terms? Are we looking at the continued autonomous region being autonomous and maintaining those principles of democratic governance that we've seen? Or are we less realistic, and or less hopeful? And if so, does it tie back to, and again, this is, I'm going to aim this at Dilar mostly, does this tie into, is it international solidarity and resistance that will prevent Rojava from being destroyed, or what? So any of the panelists, if they want to take a stab at that. And it's a hard question. I'm sorry to throw that at you guys.
I can take a little stab and then pass on to the other panelists. I mean, so I think for me, what kind of pops into my head as something that's important to remember is that, you know, the Rojava revolution isn't just the entity of the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. It's a huge symbol, and it's an important thing because it's about power, right? Like the autonomous administration and the SDF and the YPG and YPJ have established power in that space, and they've used it to, you know, build up the power of communities, the power of women, the power of young people. And so that's really important. I do think it's very likely that it will continue to be kind of integrated within the Syrian state as some kind of semi-autonomous region. I don't know, like, I'm not a diplomat. But I think one thing that really hit home for me in the middle of the invasion a year ago, when I was in Rojava and we were watching, you know, the Turkish forces and the Turkish proxy forces kind of come further and further in to Rojava, into places that only days before we had been visiting friends, you know, going to film showings, having dinner at families' houses, and that kind of feeling of like, it's all going to go, all of that is going to disappear. And then actually remembering that it's not, because the movement that has, you know, created the Rojava revolution is huge and strong and spans so much more than just an administrative structure. So I know this isn't a very technical response to your question, but I think it's also important to remember that, like, the movement is very adaptable, and it will take many shapes and many forms for the coming decades, as it has over the past half century. And we shouldn't get too caught up in always the form, and kind of look more towards like the principles and what it's achieving and what it stands for, while still acknowledging that the form is, in this instance, quite important. Happy to pass over to other panelists now.
Thanks, Viyan. Go to Argesh next, and also we'll just flag or read onto this initial question. A few people bumped one from Lucas Medeiros. What are the non-military possibilities available for foreigners, laymen, or experts to do meaningful work in Loko and Rojava at the moment? What are trustworthy or impactful organizations that would benefit from people moving there, offering their work? Just, you know, essentially the practical component. I want to throw that in there. So, Argesh.
Okay, I hope the connection's a bit better now. So to answer, I think there was a question, someone was at my door just now during that question. So I got the last part of it from Chris about something, is it possible for international solidarity to address the threats or to support the future of the movement? Is that correct? You cannot.
Yes, it is. But the first part of the question is, how hopeful are you that the revolution in Rojava can be preserved?
Oh, okay, great. So I have absolutely 100% faith that the revolution in Rojava can be preserved, but just like from my little bit of experience in the movement, I mean, I have a few years here, it's almost 4 years, but it's a drop in the bucket to the 40s, about 40 years of this movement being around, you know. But I really believe, despite all the bad news that I presented today and all of the depressing facts that I brought up, I still believe that the movement has the ability to adapt and adjust and create solutions to all these threats. And they've been dealing with new threats and different threats for as long as they've existed, and they've managed to survive, you know, like we look at the movement in Bakur and Bashur, and literally like one of the only guerrilla movements that still exists today. So I think we can take a lot of hope from that. And from the perspective of, you know, internationalism, we have through the age of the internet, we have access to people from all over the world, right? And, you know, we're able to bring together people with all kinds of skills that can offer these different kind of solutions to all these really advanced problems, you know. And I think some of this stuff seems incredibly complicated and really scary. Like when we talk about drones or electronic surveillance, like how do you even stand up against that? But actually, the solutions came from activists. They came from the internationalists. They came from the revolutionary movements around the world, like open source technology, you know, like that can give you signal or a wire on your phone, or Rise Up, you know, or Rise Up email. All this like Ubuntu, Linux, and Tails operating systems. All these really secure programs that cost nothing, that are free, that are easy to use, that can completely disarm this massive budget from, for example, the Pentagon or from Turkey, were all developed by, you know, comrades in different movements from around the world. And so that being said, I think by raising awareness, by reaching out to these comrades around the world, there are so many people with so many backgrounds that we can definitely come up with solutions together to figure out how we can deal with these threats. Like whether it's surveillance, I even believe we can figure out a solution to the Turkish drones. I mean, it's maybe a little bit delusional, but I think we can figure it out. And also, to put it into perspective, the movement has adapted even to the onset of Turkish drones by using an umbrella, you know. It's like a $2 umbrella, but it's able to defeat this multi-million-dollar technology of infrared cameras that are put into these drones, you know. So with $2, you can hide yourself more or less effectively. I mean, I swear by them from personal experience. So that being said, I have absolute faith between the movement's ability to adapt and between the collective pool of knowledge that exists in the internationalist community. I think we can find together a solution that will allow us to continue. But the most important thing is that we remember what the ideology is, and really self-criticize. Like this idea of techno and self-criticism, we have to keep it as a fundamental aspect of our daily life, so that we don't lose contact with what's most important, which is the ideological tenets, the foundations that built the revolution. You know, we can't be corrupted. Once we begin to be corrupted, then I think that's the biggest threat, actually. And what was the second question from?
We're actually basically at time, so we're going to hand things over for a final word, and then we're going to wrap up. But thank you so much for that input. Dilar?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Argesh has mentioned in response to Chris's question, is that actually in Turkey, in northern Kurdistan, after the new paradigm after 2005 began to be discussed more, and 2007 especially sparked a period in which people built up communes, popular academies, and they were in some ways so much more colorful and different than what was happening later in Rojava. So there is like Rojava is also building on the memory and the experience of democratic autonomous structures inside Bakur that were in 2009 totally destroyed by the Turkish state when a mass arrest wave imprisoned 10,000 political activists, many of whom are still in prison. And then later on, again, there was a period of the peace process between 2013 and 15. Again, a lot of these structures were built up, and they were really successful. They, for the first time, not just led to an election success of the People's Democratic Party, HDP, but they did so whilst building relationships with peace groups, with human rights organizations, Armenian groups, Arab groups inside Turkey, and the progressive left reunited in a way with the Kurdish movement. And that again was perceived as such a threat that again a mass arrest wave kind of tried to destroy all of this. Well, I'm not saying this to be negative. I'm just trying to say, yes, before Rojava, there was the experience of Bakur, then Rojava could build on it. And now Bakur now again builds on what's happening in Rojava. In the meantime, almost 10 years have passed since the revolution in Rojava. So many people have learned what it means to self-organize. They have learned not only active practical skills, but also been exposed to different ideas. People from around the world have traveled there. So I think Rojava is not something that can be destroyed, because it is more than just institutions. It's more than territory. And I'm not saying this to be idealistic or totally detached from reality. It's just everything we see today, including the resistance that the Kurdish freedom movement above all, and then later more and more communities led against ISIS, is a product of a small group of people that at some point crossed into Rojava and began organizing people. So we need to always put things into perspective. An organized society can achieve very big things, and above all, it's physical self-defense, but also the ability to organize itself against all kinds of different systems that try to attack it. So in this sense, I think similar to the Paris Commune or the Zapatista uprising, it is yet another chapter in a resistance history, if you will. It's not something that people can just forget. People cannot forget that there was, even like, let's assume the worst scenario and there's nothing, nobody left, no sign of Rojava, everything erased from history books. It's not possible that people will forget that NATO weapons were raining down on a women's movement that has not only defeated Daesh, not alone, of course, but also managed to create or to begin to create a culture in which people say actually a different life is possible in the midst of war. This is something so meaningful, so historic, it's impossible to abolish this from people's mind. But that's also, it will be erased, and it is being erased, and we see that even in the ways in which the US, for example, began talking about the Daesh war, for example, making it seem like a US military success story. The Kurds are the little soldiers of imperialism in the Middle East. No, we have to remember Rojava is women's history. Rojava is a history of solidarity between peoples. Rojava is internationalist history too. It was defended, and internationalists have died to defend the values there. So it is much, much more. It's more than about Kurdistan, but it is also about Kurdistan, right? There's a reason why this kind of system is also taking shape in a specific geography, in a specific time and space, but only with a collective defense of the revolution, only with a wider with an internationalism that is between social movements and not an internationalism between nation states. We can actively remember the preciousness of, and if you look at the YPG fighter, a symbol, for example, there were all these articles, there were fashion magazines that were taking photos of YPG and so on, but what are these women saying exactly, you know? So this is what we need to focus on, like what are the values that are being now systematically destroyed in front of the eyes of the whole world. So it's not Rojava's burden to survive, it's actually the whole world needs to chip in to make sure that we don't even think about the question, what happens if Rojava disappears? Like, that's not an option that we should have.
Dilar, thank you so much. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been a fantastically rich conversation. So I want to thank all of our panelists today, Argesh, Viyan, Dilar, and also Thomas for joining us late, really just sharing a wealth of inspiring information and experience. I want to thank our co-organizers of Chris Shaw and Katie Higgins for all the fantastic work they put into making this event happen. And of course, to all of you who are still 58, we've had 91 at least at some point, to take time out of their day to learn about this absolutely crucial and inspiring global movement. So thank you all for participating. We will be posting this on the Institute for Social Ecology's YouTube channel here soon. I also just wanted to make an invitation to everyone to join our online seminar that starts September 28th called Ecology, Democracy, Utopia, which is about exactly how do we build one too many Rojavas, how do we build a democratic confederalist society that's based on direct democracy, equality, ecology. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you comrades across the world in the months and years to come. So thank you all. Cheers, everybody.